She does not meditate. She has never taken a breathing class. She does not own a gratitude journal, a weighted blanket, or a white noise machine. She has no morning affirmation, no evening wind-down routine, no app that reminds her to check in with her feelings at 3 p.m. She has not read the literature on anxiety management, not because she has tried it and moved on, but because the specific quality of need that would send a person toward that literature has simply not been present in her life for 11 years. She has not had what she would describe as an anxious day in 11 years. You are sitting across from her in her apartment in Tokyo, trying to locate the practice, the technique, the thing she does. Because there must be something she does. The world you came from has been very clear about this. Anxiety is managed. It requires effort and intention and the correct sequence of interventions. It requires, at minimum, a strategy. And the evidence of the strategy, you have been trained to believe, should be visible somewhere in the life of the person who has achieved what she has achieved. You cannot find it. Not because she is hiding it, because it is not a practice. It is the environment, the daily structure of an apartment that has a particular property no apartment you have ever lived in has had. The absence of anxiety is not the result of what she does to manage it. It is the result of what the life around her was built to not produce. Japan's rates of generalized anxiety are among the lowest in the industrialized world. Not because the Japanese don't experience stress, their professional culture is among the most demanding, but because the daily environment was built to not produce the amygdala activation that, sustained over time, becomes the chronic anxiety that sends most people looking for the next management technique. 7 things, not 7 techniques, 7 properties of the daily life she lives that your daily life does not currently have. Here is what they look like from the inside. Anxiety is not a thought. This is the part the management industry rarely tells you, because if anxiety were a thought, the industry's products, which mostly address thoughts, would be the correct solution. Anxiety is an amygdala state. The amygdala, the almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe, is the brain's threat detection system. It receives sensory inputs before conscious thought, evaluates them for threat relevance in milliseconds, and activates the stress response before the thinking brain has had a moment to assess the situation. By the time you are aware that you are anxious, the cortisol is already rising. The amygdala acted first. This is why cognitive approaches to anxiety work for some people some of the time and not for others. Because the anxiety was not, in the first instance, a cognitive event. It was a subcortical one. Addressing it cognitively is addressing the second thing that happened. The first thing that happened was the amygdala reading the environment. And the environment, the physical, sensory, temporal environment that the person inhabits throughout the day, is the primary input stream that the amygdala is reading. A cluttered visual field keeps the amygdala partially activated, because unresolved visual information registers as unresolved threat. A schedule with no margins keeps the amygdala activated, because the absence of buffer time means the system is always in a state of potential overrun. A home that contains the residue of the outside world, its sounds, its contamination, its pace, keeps the amygdala reading the outside world even when the person is ostensibly at rest. The Japanese home, the Japanese schedule, the Japanese relationship with silence and with the transition between outside and inside, all of it is, functionally, an amygdala management system, not designed as one, not named as one, but functioning as one, which is why the person who lives inside it has not needed a management system for 11 years. Joseph Ledoux at New York University has spent decades documenting what he calls the low road of emotional processing, the direct pathway from sensory input to amygdala activation that bypasses conscious thought. The amygdala does not wait for your opinion. It receives the input, assesses the threat potential, and initiates the stress response in a fraction of the time it takes for the information to reach the prefrontal cortex for conscious evaluation. By the time you think about whether something is worth being anxious about, the anxiety is already in your body. This means that the inputs the amygdala receives throughout the day determine the anxiety load of the day in a way that thinking about anxiety does not and cannot address. The question is not, how do I manage my anxious thoughts? The question is, what inputs is my amygdala receiving throughout the day? Dr. Ching Li at Nippon Medical School has documented, across decades of research on Shinrin-yoku, what happens to the amygdala and the cortisol system when a person spends time in a natural environment. His findings are consistent. Cortisol declines measurably. NK cell activity, a direct marker of immune function, increases significantly. And the specific quality of amygdala activation that characterizes chronic anxiety does not occur in natural environments the way it occurs in urban ones. The natural environment is not a treatment for anxiety. It is an environment in which the amygdala operates differently. The Japanese home, the Japanese morning, the Japanese relationship with natural spaces, all of it is, from the amygdala's perspective, an environment calibrated to produce a different baseline. 7 habits produce that baseline. None of them are practices. All of them are environmental properties. The first thing she does when she arrives home is remove her shoes. Not as a cultural habit observed because culture demands it, though culture does demand it, but as the physical enactment of a boundary that the nervous system recognizes and responds to with measurable precision. The Genkan, the small dedicated entryway where outdoor shoes come off and indoor slippers go on, is not just a threshold between outside and inside. It is a signal, a clear, unambiguous, physical signal that the nervous system receives and processes as the outside world ends here. The outside world has been asking things of the amygdala all day. The commute, the office, the interactions, the pace of the city, all of it has been maintaining a level of amygdala activation appropriate to an environment that requires continuous, low-level threat assessment. The Genkan says, that environment is over. This one is different. Research on contextual fear conditioning, the mechanism by which the brain links environments to emotional states, has established that physical cues are among the most potent triggers for emotional state transitions. The brain learns, over time, that specific physical environments correspond to specific emotional states. A clear, consistent physical boundary between the outside environment and the home environment accelerates the nervous system's ability to make that transition. She removes her shoes. She places them on the rack with a specific, unhurried precision that has become, over 11 years, the small ritual of transition, rather than merely the domestic act of putting shoes away. She slides her feet into the slippers, and something in the nervous system makes a decision before the conscious mind has had time to register the decision being made. The outside world does not follow her in. And the amygdala, freed of the outside world's continuous low-level demand for alertness, begins its descent toward the baseline the home was built to provide. The apartment does not contain uncertainty. Not the uncertainty of the refrigerator with its probability items, she addressed that years ago. Not the uncertainty of the surface that has accumulated the unresolved, she addressed that too. The apartment does not contain the particular category of uncertainty that the amygdala is most sensitive to. Visual disorder without resolution. Things that are somewhere rather than in their place. Surfaces that carry the residue of the day without having been cleared. The low table that has on it whatever was put there last rather than what belongs there. Princeton Neuroscience Institute's research on visual clutter, encountered in previous videos in this series, established that unresolved visual information competes for neural resources and maintains a level of amygdala activation that does not occur in an ordered visual environment. But the mechanism is more specific than the general clutter research suggests. The amygdala is specifically activated by unresolved information it cannot categorize, assess, and dismiss. A surface covered in random objects cannot be assessed and dismissed. The assessment runs continuously, at low amplitude, for as long as the objects are in the visual field. Her apartment can be assessed and dismissed at a glance. Every object is in its designated place. Every surface carries only what belongs to it. The glance travels across the room and finds nothing unresolved, nothing requiring response, nothing flagging itself as a potential demand. And the amygdala, finding nothing to respond to, does not respond. This is not aesthetic minimalism. It is functional neurology. The arranged environment is the environment in which the amygdala can complete its assessment cycle and stand down. And the standing down, repeated every time the eyes scan the room, dozens of times across the evening, is the cumulative resting of the threat detection system that produces the cortisol profile she took to her doctor last month. Every morning, before the day has made its first demand, she walks. Not for fitness, not for steps, not with earphones or a podcast, or the particular disciplined focus of a person using the walk to achieve something. She walks in the way that the Kyoto woman in the previous video walked, without destination, without urgency, through the neighborhood that the morning is currently offering. Because the morning walk, taken in this specific way, does something to the amygdala that nothing else in the day does. The Stanford researcher who documented the optic flow effect established the mechanism with precision. Optic flow is the visual experience of the environment moving past you on either side as you move through it. This specific pattern of visual motion, the world sliding past the periphery of the visual field, produces a measurable and specific quieting of the amygdala, not a general calming, a targeted reduction in the activation of the precise brain structure that is the source of the anxiety. The evolutionary logic is available. An organism moving through an environment, with the visual field showing the world flowing steadily past, is an organism that is not under attack. The amygdala, reading the optic flow, reads, moving, not threatened. The alarm does not ring for an organism moving purposefully through an uncontested environment. A treadmill facing a wall does not produce this effect. The optic flow requires actual movement through actual space. A podcast removes the attention from the visual field and prevents the optic flow from being processed. The effect requires only that the person be present in the movement, with the world moving past them, and the morning receiving whatever attention it wants to offer. She has walked this way most mornings for 11 years. The amygdala she brings to the day is not the amygdala she woke with. It has been walked. Once a week, sometimes twice, she goes to a park. Not to exercise, not to sit and journal, not to walk a measured distance, not to be productive in the space the park offers. To be in it, in the specific and unremarkable way of someone who goes to a park the way another person would sit in a favorite chair. Not to do anything, but to inhabit a space that produces a certain quality of being. The science behind Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, is the work of decades of Japanese research that has now been replicated in multiple countries and is no longer contested as a finding, only as a mechanism. Dr. Ching Li's research is the most comprehensive. Subjects who spent 2 days in a forest environment showed a 50% increase in NK cell activity, a direct measure of immune function, that persisted for 7 days after the forest exposure. Cortisol levels dropped by 12%. The specific hormonal signature of chronic anxiety was reduced. The mechanism is partially chemical. Trees produce phytoncides, volatile organic compounds they release to protect themselves from insects and disease. When humans breathe phytoncides, the compounds interact with the autonomic nervous system in ways that are now well documented. Cortisol declines, the parasympathetic nervous system activates, the inflammatory markers that accompany chronic anxiety decrease. But the mechanism is also environmental. The natural environment simply does not contain the inputs that maintain amygdala activation in urban spaces. No notifications, no unresolved visual information, no sounds that the amygdala must assess for threat. The natural sound environment, wind, birds, water, is precisely the auditory environment in which the human amygdala, evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, does not need to be vigilant. She sits under a tree in a park in Tokyo once a week. She brings nothing with her that she needs to do. The trees do the rest, and the amygdala that she carries home is not the one she arrived with. She does not schedule back-to-back. This habit appeared in the unhurried morning video, in the context of time and punctuality. Here it appears again, in the context of anxiety, because the mechanism is different from the one that produces the rushed morning. The back-to-back schedule is not just a time management problem. It is a chronic anticipatory anxiety generator. When an activity ends and the next begins without interval, the amygdala does not have the opportunity to complete what researchers call the deactivation cycle, the return to baseline that follows the resolution of a demand. The nervous system remains in the activation state of the completed demand throughout the preparation for the next one. By midday, in a back-to-back schedule, the amygdala is carrying the activation residue of everything that has happened since morning, without having had a single opportunity to return to baseline between them. The deliberate empty space between things, not dead time, not inefficiency, the specific and intentional interval in which the nervous system is permitted to complete its deactivation cycle before the next activation is initiated. She builds 3 to 5 minutes between every commitment. Not minutes filled with checking the phone, that reactivates the amygdala through the notification stream. Minutes in which nothing is demanded, in which the body is allowed to register that the previous thing is finished and the next thing has not yet begun. This is the smallest of the 7 habits in terms of time. It is among the most significant in terms of cumulative anxiety. The person who has never had a deactivation cycle in their schedule carries, by evening, the accumulated activation of a full day without a single true rest. And they describe this, in language that the anxiety industry has normalized, as just how they feel. There is a Japanese word that is sometimes translated as gratitude, but is not quite the same as the gratitude the Western wellness industry has been selling for the last decade. Kansha. Appreciation, but not performed appreciation. Not the deliberate listing of things to be grateful for, which research has found to be effective only under specific conditions and for specific personalities. Kansha is closer to a quality of noticing, the specific attentional habit of seeing what is already sufficient before registering what is absent. The anxiety of scarcity, the particular quality of low-level anxiety that comes from inhabiting a life through the lens of what it does not yet contain, is the most prevalent form of ambient anxiety in the contemporary Western world. Not acute anxiety about a specific threat, the background anxiety of the open-ended aspiration, the life that is almost where it should be, the sense that the present moment is slightly insufficient relative to the future moment it is pointing toward. Research on sufficiency orientation, the habitual tendency to notice what is sufficient, rather than what is missing, has found that it produces measurably lower baseline anxiety than the scarcity orientation the advertising culture cultivates. The present moment experienced as complete does not generate the cortisol of perpetual incompleteness. Kansha is not something she practices, it is something she does. The cup of tea that is held and noticed, the morning light through the window that she pauses for one breath to receive, the meal that is given the attention required to register that it is good. These are not mindfulness exercises. They are the attentional habits of a person who has never learned to look past the present moment in search of the better one that is coming. And the amygdala of a person who is not looking for the threat in the present moment runs, across the day, at a measurably different level than the amygdala of a person who is. The last habit is the simplest and the most uncomfortable. She is comfortable with silence. Not the silence of isolation. The silence of an ordinary Tuesday evening in her apartment, when the sounds of the city are at the level of background and nothing inside the apartment is generating noise. She is simply in the room, reading, or preparing the next day's clothes, or doing nothing in particular, without having introduced a podcast, a television show, or any form of continuous audio stimulation to fill the quiet. This is the habit most people in the contemporary world find most confronting. The impulse to fill silence, the specific discomfort that arrives in a quiet moment and reaches for stimulation before the moment can ask what it contains, is so normalized that most people do not recognize it as an anxiety symptom. It is an anxiety symptom. The discomfort with silence is the amygdala's avoidance of the unprocessed material that silence makes available, the emotional residue of the day that was never given time to settle. Research on silence and the nervous system found that even 2 minutes of genuine, unoccupied silence produces measurable amygdala quieting and activates the default mode network, the brain's internal processing system that integrates emotional experience and cannot activate while the brain is externally occupied. The person who fills every silence is the person whose default mode network never runs. The emotional residue accumulates. The self-knowledge does not deepen. The amygdala, never allowed to settle into genuine stillness, maintains its low-level alertness indefinitely. She does not fill the silence, not because she decided not to, because the culture she grew up in and the apartment she has been building for 11 years contain within them the understanding that silence is not something to be managed or avoided. It is something to be inhabited. And the inhabiting of it, practiced across 11 years of ordinary Tuesday evenings, has produced the cortisol profile she took to her doctor. The doctor did not know what to make of it. She did not find it remarkable. "You are still in the apartment?" She has not given you a technique. She has not prescribed a practice, recommended an app, or suggested that you try the breathing exercise that worked for her. She has offered you tea and an hour of her company in the apartment that the 7 habits produced. And the apartment itself, the quality of the air in it, the quietness of the visual field, the particular property of a space that does not ask anything of you, has been doing something to your amygdala for the last hour, without either of you having mentioned it. What you found is not a technique. It is an environment, and the environment is what the 7 habits produce, not by managing anxiety once it arrives, but by removing the conditions that would have produced it. The Genkan, the physical line that the outside world's amygdala activation does not cross. The arranged environment, the visual field where nothing is unresolved. The amygdala completing its scan and standing down. Sanpo, the morning walk in which the optic flow quiets the alarm before the day has the chance to ring it. Shinrin-yoku, the weekly hour in which the phytoncides and the natural soundscape do the biochemical work that no supplement has replicated. Ma, the 3 to 5 minutes between commitments in which the nervous system completes its deactivation cycle before the next activation begins. Kansha, the attentional habit of noticing what is sufficient before registering what is absent. And Seijaku, the silence that is not filled, the default mode network doing the internal work that continuous stimulation prevents. Tonight, 10 minutes. Not a meditation, not a breathing exercise, not an app. Turn off everything that is producing sound in the room you are in. Do not reach for the phone. Do not introduce anything to replace what you just turned off. Sit in the quiet for 10 minutes. Notice what the first 4 minutes feel like. The discomfort, the impulse toward the phone. Let it be there. Then notice what minutes 5 through 10 feel like when the discomfort settles. That settling is the default mode network beginning to do the work it has been waiting to do. The amygdala, briefly, in the state it has been in, every evening in this apartment for 11 years. She has not had an anxious day in 11 years. She did not achieve this. She simply never left the quiet long enough for the anxiety to need her management. Tonight is the first 10 minutes. Share this with someone who has tried every anxiety management technique and still feels like they are managing rather than healed. They may not need a better technique. They may need a different environment.